Hello English 1102 students, welcome to this video which is going to tell you how to write a bang-up prose essay. An essay on whichever short story you choose, and if you follow these instructions in this video and on the written instructions, you should do very well in this paper. Now, what I'm going to do is take a second and I'm going to pause, and what I want you to do is to open up the instructions on the prose essay and either have them minimized on your screen so you can pull them up and read along, or you can print them up in hard copy if you so choose. So I'm going to pause. You should hit the pause button as well to give you enough time to get that open. Just go into the prose essay module and then open the instructions up. Okay, I'm back. Alright, let's get started. So if we look at these instructions, which I've already printed up here, you'll see that there's a due date. Now, the first thing I want to say about this is follow these instructions carefully. Everything you need to know to do well in this paper is in these instructions. These have been tweaked, these have been adjusted, these have been changed over time, because sometimes I might forget something, or sometimes I might leave something out, or I might have some information that's not necessary. So over the course of years, this has been fine-tuned so that everything you need to know should be in this paper. All right. And the first thing you need to know is the timeline. So notice that there's a due date on there. Follow all of the due dates. Now, if you're taking this course in the summer, you don't have to write multiple drafts. If you are taking this course in the fall or the spring, you're going to have to actually have two drafts, because there'll be a draft, a conference, and then a final draft. But if you're taking this in the summer, know this. I'm not requiring you to write early drafts, but you really should. And what you can do to get my input to help you write a better draft is attach it to an email. Don't put it in the Dropbox. You put it in the Dropbox in the summer. Now, in the fall or spring, you'll be required to put it in the Dropbox. But in the summer, if you put it in the Dropbox, I'm going to grade it. So you want to attach it to an email and send it to me that way. Then also know that if you do that on the due date, I probably won't have time to read it. So give it to me a couple, 2 or 3 days early. So that way I'll have time to actually read it and give you the input. If the paper's due at midnight on a certain night and you send something to me at 10 o'clock that night and want me to read it, it's not going to happen. You can write it off. So give me plenty of time. The length is about 500 to 750 words. That is usually about 2 to 3 pages in MLA format. That'll be standard for all the short essays. The research paper will be longer, but we will talk about the research paper when we get there. So about 500 to 750 words is all you're going to need. All right, now let's read the directions. Choose one. Notice one of the short stories. I don't want to compare and contrast. I don't want you to talk about multiple stories. Pick one and focus on it, and write a really good paper on that one story. So choose one of the short stories we read in class and write a well-planned out, coherent essay that argues a point you want to make about the story. Now, all this stuff that are reminders of what makes a good essay. You should have a nice introduction that has a lead into your thesis statement. You should have clear, precise thesis statement, good, strong topic sentences in each paragraph, usually the first sentence. Plenty of development in the paragraph through the use of specific examples and quotes and so on and so forth. And then a conclusion that either summarizes a point or emphasizes something very important. We're going to talk more about that as we get into the rubric. But every good essay should have these 5 qualities. So pay attention to that. All right, so you're probably sitting here thinking, gosh, I got to write this prose essay on one of the 5 short stories. I don't even know where to begin. Well, here I put ideas for how to generate ideas for your paper. And let's take a look at those ways to generate ideas. Number 1, look at the questions at the end of the story in the textbook. So the textbook you've got will probably, depending on which textbook I've assigned, will probably have some questions at the end of the actual story that you read. Maybe, looking at those questions, you think, there's a topic I can use. So think about that. Go through my PowerPoint slideshows on D2L and look at the questions or issues that I've raised there. Your PowerPoints aren't going to give you story summaries or plots, but they will give you points to think about as you read each story. So that might be a way to do it. You can discuss the story with me during my office hours, or with your classmates on free time. Now, if you're in an online class, that's not going to be possible for many of you because you live out of town. But you can call me up during my office hours and say, hey, I really want to write about the Cast Amontillado, but I don't know where to start. And we can discuss this. My first question will be, well, why did you like the story so much? Will probably be my first question. Because you're going to pick a story, I'm sure, that you actually liked. That's the way to write a good essay. If you pick a story you didn't like very much, my experience with students has been when students do that, the essay doesn't turn out very well. So make sure that you pick something you like. But you can talk to me about that. And then finally, in the Schools of Literary Theory section of these instructions, I have sample questions based on the literary theory. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, here's what I would not recommend. I do not recommend visiting a website like Wikipedia or SparkNotes. I especially do not recommend the students go to a website where they can purchase paper with a credit card. I have had students plagiarize at one of these websites, and when I say you're getting a 0 on the paper, they say, well, I didn't copy that paper. I just went to echeat.com to get ideas on how to what to write about in my paper. I'm like, well, first of all, the name echeat.com tells you everything you need to know about the website. Second of all, you did copy it because I've got the report right here from turnitin.com that'll show you exactly where you copied from that. And sometimes students say, well, I didn't mean to. Well, whether you meant to or not, it's still plagiarism and it's still 0. So, do not put yourself in that position by visiting these websites. Try to generate your ideas through other methods. All right. So with that in mind, we're going to go through the schools of literary theory. I'm going to start with feminist. Now, I'm only going to use one of these examples. But essentially what feminist theory does is it looks at the relationship between men and women. And usually it looks at how men oppress women in some way. So one good example that I may have assigned to you in this class, or I may not have, depending on what semester you're taking this course. But one good example I may have given you is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I'm telling you, that woman is driven crazy by her husband. And a lot of married women say, my husband drives me crazy. And, well, maybe we do. But this lady literally gets driven crazy to the point of absolute insanity and having to be institutionalized as a result of her husband's actions. So, and you can see examples here based upon the stories we've chosen for this semester that can help you if you want to look at a feminist view of a particular story. There's formalism and new criticism. Not very many critics do formalism anymore, but you can look at how a story is structured and make some comments on that. So a good example of this might be The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. I don't remember if we read that in this semester. Well, this particular semester we didn't read The Lottery. This particular semester we read Cast Amontillado, and we can look at how Montresor lures Fortunato to his death. So you can actually take a look at that and follow the step-by-step on that. That would be formalism. Marxist criticism looks at social structure, looks at the dynamic between the haves and the have-nots, the conflict between the rich and the poor, the conflict between the bosses and the employees. Or, in the case of Battle Royal, the white rich town leaders, like the mayors and the business owners, and the young, poor African-American boys that are fresh out of high school. So, these power structures where one group has all the money and has all the power and is willing to squash other groups in order to keep that, that is a Marxist look at something. And again, Battle Royal would be a really good way to address that. New Historicism and Cultural Studies. A good example of this might be in A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. It looks at a story in the time that it takes place. There are many stories that we are going to read that could only take place in its particular time period. A Rose for Emily is a great example. It occurs really from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And for this particular story, which takes place in a fictional town in Mississippi called Jefferson, this story could not take place in New York City. This story could not take place in the year 1985. It could not take place in the year 1700. It could only take place in the time period that it takes place. So a look at the conflict between New South and Old South in A Rose for Emily, because basically Emily represents the Old South, the antebellum South, and the Reconstruction South. Whereas the New South is represented by the young town leaders that are rising up into power. And there's a conflict there between Emily and those new town leaders. So, that would be new historicism. Once Emily dies, that story can never take place again. There's not another time period in world history where that particular story could have taken place. And not another place where it could have taken place other than in the Deep South, whether it's Mississippi, Alabama, or wherever. Then we've got psychoanalytic or Freudian theory. This is where you psychoanalyze somebody. And one of the most common papers I get on this is an analysis of Montresor from the Cask of Amontillado. You can make two arguments about Montresor. You can make the argument that he is absolutely insane, absolutely crazy, should be put in a nut house. However, he gets away with murder, and he does it by careful planning and considering all angles. So you could make the argument that this murderous man is actually a genius. Which side do you take? So that is how you can approach the Cask of Amontillado by psychoanalyzing Montresor. And we have several characters throughout this semester that you can actually psychoanalyze. So, looking through those schools of theory, I have sample questions in each school of theory that might help you to actually generate an idea for an essay. So it depends on what you want to look at. Alright, then I got other ideas that don't fall into these categories. Okay. My expectations from this essay. If you want to know what my expectations are, boom, there it is in all caps and underlined and bold. What I expect. And the first one, and this is probably the most important, I expect this to be an analysis and not a story summary. If you give me what happens in a story from beginning to end, and this is where you run into a little danger if you try the formalist approach. If you give me, story starts off like this, the next thing that happens is that, the next thing that happens is this, the next thing that happens is that, and in the end this happens, that will be a failing paper. If I want a story summary, I can just go to Wikipedia. So, I want you to give me an analysis. And how do you give me an analysis? You answer a question. Instead of actually giving me the summary of the story, you might answer the question about Montresor's sanity or insanity. You might answer the question about how Emily looks at the Old South and New South. You might answer whatever other question it is that you choose to answer. That's how you avoid the story summary. Should be foregrounded in logos. Logos is one of the three modes of persuasion that Aristotle mentions in his book, Poetics. If you're not familiar with this, some of you may have gotten this lesson already in English 1101 or perhaps in philosophy or perhaps in whatever. But Aristotle said there are three modes of persuasion. There's ethos, which is about ethics. Trust me, I'm an ethical person, I would not lie to you. That is persuasion number one. Persuasion number two is logos, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then persuasion number three is pathos or pathos, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And that is using emotion. And that can be effective in some ways, but it can also be dangerous when the emotion being used is anger or fear. But logos is logic. Logos is, here's the evidence, look at this evidence, analyze this evidence. Based upon this evidence, one must come to such and such a conclusion. So, logos is used in logic. If A is true, and if B is true, you must come to conclusion C. And the most famous of this is about Socrates. If all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, then you must come to the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. So that's the use of logos. So use logos in your papers. Don't try to move me with a lot of emotion. And don't say, hey, trust me, I'm a good person. I do expect direct quotes from this chosen story. A lot of students lose points on this because they don't include the direct quotes. You must have direct quotes in your paper. I require it. And they must be formatted properly. And I will have a handout in the folder that shows you how to properly, in fact, I think I'm going to put it in the MLA folder, that shows you how to properly quote from a short story or from a essay or something like that. If you do not have any direct quotes, you don't get any points for correctly formatting quotes because you can't correctly format something that doesn't exist. So you get a 0 on that part of the rubric. We'll go through the rubric step by step in a minute. All right. And then use specific details. Don't be vague. This is where direct quotes can help you. One of the things that can help you in this paper is the use of the words for example. So if you say Emily was defiant against the town leaders, then you follow that with something like, for example, when they sent her a tax notice, she sent it back unopened. That's an example, a specific example of how she's defiant. So it's not just enough to say that something is true, but using a for example can help back that up. So use that to your advantage. So those are my expectations. Read them carefully and follow them. Then we got the rubric. Formatting. 6 points of this is formatting. There is a handout in the MLA folder, how to set up an MLA template. It will show you how to double space, how to have the correct 12-point times number one font, how to make sure there's no extra space between paragraphs, which is a big violation for many students. It will show you how to, in fact, it's all listed right here in the rubric. How to have a correct header. All of that's listed in the rubric. Go into that MLA template handout, open it, follow the directions, and there's pictures and everything to make it easy for you. And you should get all 6 of those points. There's no reason why you should ever lose a point on that. And yet, every semester, probably half the students lose points on that. Thesis statement. This is something that you should have been taught about in English 1101. A good, strong, clear thesis statement tells me, the reader, in one sentence, what your essay is going to be about. Usually you can have what's called a 3-pronged thesis statement. So, X is true because of 1, 2, 3. And then as you go through your essay, you're going to talk about 1 first, you're going to talk about 2 second, you're going to talk about 3 third, and then in the end you're going to say, therefore, because all of these are true, the main premise is true. So, notice my guidelines here. It's very clear. It's spoken with conviction. Do not say something like, I believe or I think. Say it like you mean it. It's not formed in the form of a question. And it's usually going to appear as the last sentence of the opening paragraph. I'm going to look for your thesis statement in the final sentence of the opening paragraph. If it's not there, you're probably going to lose points. And if I can't find a thesis statement, you'll get a 0 on this part of the rubric. So there needs to be a good, clear thesis statement. Organization and structure, all that means is that there has to be a clear beginning, middle, and end. So you have to introduce your essay. You have to finish that introduction with your thesis statement. You've got the body, which is where you explore the thesis. And then your conclusion. In your conclusion, you're going to do one of 2 things. You're either going to summarize what you've talked about already in the essay very briefly, or you might emphasize a point that you really think is important that you want your reader to come away with. Give the reader a takeaway, if you will. So, the organization and structure is 15 points. Main primary points. And notice I've used baseball as an example because I umpire a baseball game, so it's something that comes natural to me. Your main points are the main points that are going to support the thesis statement. So if I'm going to say that a certain team is going to win the World Series, I'm going to base that on my 3 main points of hitting, pitching, and fielding. Or actually, I think I've got it. It's actually pitching, hitting, and fielding in this order. All right? So those are my main points. Because this team has great pitching, great hitting, and they field beautifully, they're going to win the World Series. Supporting details. That is 20 points of the rubric. That's the biggest part of the rubric, except for the grammar. These are the details to back them up. So if your main point is strong pitching, then your details might be ERA, strikeouts, powerful arms, not blowing saves. You've got an example there. Those are the details to back up the pitching. So this team's going to win the World Series because of pitching, hitting, and fielding. The details are the pitching, low ERA, powerful arms, lots of strikeouts, not blowing saves. In the hitting, a lot of RBIs. If you don't follow baseball, you want lots of RBIs. That's a good thing. One particular guy leads the league in home runs and RBIs, and they have all kinds of ninth inning comeback wins. They're never out of it. When they go to the ninth inning, they can still win the game against anybody's closer. And then fielding, the same thing. So you got to have good, strong details. That for example I was telling you about earlier, that is where the details are. So I say, Emily is defiant against the town leaders and arose for Emily. For example, that for example is the detail. For example, she sends back the tax notice unopened. Okay. Quotations formatting, again, if you don't have direct quotes, you're not going to be able to get any points there because you can't format something that doesn't exist. I will have a handout in the MLA folder that actually tells you how to properly quote from a short story. It'd actually be titled Quoting Prose, I think. So, Quoting Prose handout. And then grammar. You have to be able to write on a collegiate level. I don't want a ton of misspellings. I don't want a ton of agreement errors. I don't want to see pronouns misused. I don't want to see missing punctuation marks. Or if you ask a question, I don't want to see it punctuated with a period instead of a quotation or a question mark. And you see I've got a list of the most common violations. And notice that bottom one, you. Do not, in any paper in my class, use the word you unless you pull it out of a direct quote. So, for example, in Two Kinds, when Jean May is talking about her mother says, you need to be an obedient daughter. If you're directly quoting Jean May's mother, that's perfectly fine. Jean May says, you want me to be something I am not. That's fine because you're quoting Jean May. Jean May says, you want me to be something I'm not. Therefore, you have to say, in quotation marks, you want me to be something I am not. However, you, the author, cannot say you. So don't say to me, when you read this story, you are going to feel happy. Because you have no idea how I felt when I read that story. So don't use the word you in an essay. And that is something that I will hammer students on. If your 1101 teacher didn't do it, you're going to get it from me. All right, clarity issues, verb tense, consistency, all that stuff. So you can look at that on your own. So that's the rubric. So if you take the time to look at this closely, if you write multiple drafts, if you follow these instructions, there's no reason why you can't get a passing grade on this essay. I've tried to give you everything you need to get a passing grade on this essay. Please, I'm begging you to follow along with that and to do a good job with it. Okay? So that's it. That's how you write a really good prose paper in my English 1102 class. If you have further questions, feel free to send me an email or feel free to call me or come by my office during my office hours.